I never thought a simple fence would thrust me into the center of a suburban war, but that's exactly what happened on a crisp September morning in Oakridge Heights, a seemingly peaceful community in Fairfield, Connecticut. The sound of sirens pierced the quiet neighborhood, their wailing growing louder as they approached my property. I stood frozen beside my half-completed cedar fence, hammer still in hand, utterly bewildered as two police cruisers screeched to a halt in front of my driveway. My name is Callahan, and I had moved to Oakridge Heights just 6 months prior, seeking a quiet place to rebuild my life after a messy divorce. The modest colonial with its overgrown yard and dated interior had seemed perfect a fixer-upper that would keep my mind occupied while I adjusted to my new reality. What I hadn't bargained for was Brenda Williams, the self-appointed queen of the Oakridge Heights Homeowners Association, and her equally insufferable husband, Gary. "Sir, we received a call about an unauthorized construction project that violates local building codes," the first officer said, approaching me with a cautious demeanor. "Are you the homeowner?" I nodded, still dumbfounded. "Yes, officer. I'm just putting up a fence on my property. I have all the permits." From across the street, I could see Brenda standing on her immaculate lawn, arms crossed triumphantly over her pink cardigan. Beside her stood Gary, cell phone still in hand, nodding vigorously as if he'd just saved the neighborhood from some terrible calamity. "We'll need to see those permits, sir," the second officer said. I set my hammer down and wiped my palms on my jeans. "Of course. They're inside. But can I ask what exactly I'm being accused of?" The first officer glanced at his notes. "We received a report of unauthorized construction that violates HOA regulations and potentially crosses property lines. The caller was concerned about potential property value depreciation and safety hazards." I couldn't help but laugh, which clearly made the officers uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, but this is ridiculous. I've followed every rule in the book. Come inside, I'll show you all the documentation." As we walked toward my house, Brenda's shrill voice cut through the air. "Officers, he didn't get HOA approval for that monstrosity. It's against our covenant." The second officer turned to her. "Madam, please stay where you are. We'll address your concerns once we've reviewed the documentation." Inside my house, I pulled out the thick folder of permits, property surveys, and even my correspondence with the HOA board. 3 weeks earlier, I had submitted my fence plans to the board, complete with material samples and design specifications. The response had been a terse email saying my application was under review. But according to the HOA bylaws, if no decision was communicated within 14 days, approval was automatically granted. The officers reviewed the documents carefully. "Everything seems to be in order, Mr. Callahan. You have the town permits, and based on these property surveys, the fence is well within your boundary lines." I nodded, relieved but still angry. "And the HOA bylaws clearly state that after 14 days without a response, my project is automatically approved. I've waited 21 days. The first officer, whose name tag read Rodriguez, closed the folder. "We'll explain this to the complainants. Sorry for the disruption to your day." When we stepped back outside, Brenda and Gary had migrated to the edge of my property, along with a small crowd of curious neighbors. Brenda's face was flushed with indignation, her blonde bob quivering as she gesticulated wildly. "He's destroying our neighborhood aesthetic. That fence is at least 2 inches taller than regulations allow." Officer Rodriguez approached them calmly. "Mr. Callahan has provided all the necessary documentation, including town permits. The fence is within his property boundaries, and he followed proper HOA procedures for approval. Gary stepped forward, his polo shirt stretched tight across his substantial belly. But Brenda never approved it. She's the HOA president. According to the HOA bylaws, I interjected, holding up the printed document, if the board doesn't respond within 14 days, approval is automatic. It's been 21 days since my submission. Brenda's face turned an even deeper shade of red. That's not how we do things here. We need to properly review each application at our monthly meetings. Officer Rodriguez looked tired. Madam, sir, this is a civil matter. Mr. Callahan isn't violating any laws. I suggest you review your HOA bylaws and resolve this through proper channels. Calling 911 for this kind of dispute is an inappropriate use of emergency services. The officers left shortly after, leaving me face to face with Brenda, Gary, and several neighbors I hadn't yet met. The tension in the air was palpable. "This isn't over, Callahan," Brenda hissed, her perfectly manicured finger pointing at my chest. "The board will vote to have that fence removed at our next meeting." I stood my ground. "The board can vote however they want, but I've followed the rules. Your own bylaws protect me." As Brenda and Gary retreated to their house, a middle-aged woman with curly brown hair approached me. "Don't mind Hurricane Brenda," she said with a warm smile. "She does this to everyone new. I'm Margaret Chen from 2 doors down." "Ian Callahan," I replied, grateful for the friendly face. "Is it always this dramatic around here?" Margaret laughed. "Only when Brenda's involved. She's been president for 5 years running, mostly because no one else wants the job. Nice fence, by the way. About time someone stood up to the queen bee." Over the next few days, I completed my fence without further police intervention, though I could feel Brenda's glare burning into my back whenever I worked in the yard. The fence was nothing extraordinary, just a 6-foot cedar privacy fence enclosing my backyard, where I planned to create a small garden sanctuary. In my former life, before the divorce, I'd been too busy climbing the corporate ladder to enjoy simple pleasures like gardening. Now, at 42, I was determined to find peace in the small things. A week later, a certified letter arrived in my mailbox. The Oakridge Heights HOA was formally demanding I remove my non-conforming structure within 7 days or face daily fines of $100. According to the letter, my fence violated Section 7, Paragraph 3 of the HOA covenant. All fences must maintain the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood and not exceed 5'8" in height. I measured my fence again. It was exactly 5'10" tall, 2 inches over the limit. I'd never noticed that specific height restriction in the bylaws, but then again, I'd skimmed the 47-page document rather than reading every line. Still, the automatic approval clause should have protected me. That evening, I received a text from Margaret. "HOA emergency meeting tomorrow, 7 p.m. at the community center. They're gunning for your fence. Thought you should know." I thanked her and spent the rest of the night researching HOA regulations and homeowner rights in Connecticut. By morning, I had a game plan and a new ally, Patricia Campbell, a real estate attorney I'd found who specialized in HOA disputes. Her advice was clear: attend the meeting, record everything, and don't agree to anything without proper documentation. The Oakridge Heights Community Center was a converted Victorian house at the entrance to our subdivision. When I arrived for the 7 p.m. meeting, the parking lot was surprisingly full. Word had apparently spread about the fence dispute. Inside, folding chairs had been arranged in rows facing a small table where Brenda sat with 4 other board members. Gary hovered nearby, setting up a projector. Brenda's face soured when she spotted me, but she quickly composed herself into a mask of professional courtesy. "Mr. Callahan, we weren't expecting you," she said, her voice honey-sweet with underlying venom. "I received information about this emergency meeting," I replied evenly. "Since it concerns my property, I thought I should attend." Brenda's smile tightened. "This is a board meeting, not a general membership meeting. But you're welcome to observe, of course." I took a seat in the back row as more neighbors filtered in. Margaret gave me a subtle thumbs up from across the room. At precisely 7 p.m., Brenda called the meeting to order. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," she began. "We've called this emergency session to address a serious violation of our community standards that threatens the aesthetic integrity of Oakridge Heights." Gary dimmed the lights and projected a series of photos onto the wall all of my fence from various angles, some clearly taken from inside their property line, to make the fence appear more imposing. "As you can see," Brenda continued, "this structure violates our height restrictions by a full 2 inches and uses materials that don't harmonize with neighborhood standards." A middle-aged man in the front row raised his hand. "Brenda, that fence looks fine to me. What's the actual problem here?" Brenda straightened her pearl necklace. "The problem, Frank, is that rules exist for a reason. If we allow one homeowner to violate the covenant, soon everyone will think they can do whatever they want. Property values will plummet." Another neighbor, an elderly woman with silver hair, spoke up. "I've lived here for 30 years. And I can tell you that fence is nicer than half the houses in this neighborhood. Are we really having an emergency meeting over 2 inches?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, clearly not what Brenda had anticipated. Her eyes narrowed as she tapped her gavel. "Order, please. This isn't just about a fence. It's about proper procedures. Mr. Callahan failed to obtain board approval before beginning construction." That was my cue. I stood up, drawing all eyes in the room. "Actually, I submitted my application 28 days ago. According to Section 12 of the bylaws, approval is automatic if the board doesn't respond within 14 days. Brenda's face flushed. "Your application was incomplete. We needed more information about materials and dimensions." "Then you should have requested that information," I countered, pulling out my folder of documentation. "I have delivery confirmation of my complete application, including material samples and design specifications. I never received any request for additional information." Gary stepped forward, his face reddening. "You're new here, Callahan. You don't understand how things work. Brenda has maintained property values in this neighborhood for years with her diligence, by having people arrested for building permitted structures on their own property." The words left my mouth before I could stop them. The room fell silent. Then, slowly, chuckles began to ripple through the audience. "He's got a point," someone called out. "Calling the police was a bit much, Brenda." Brenda slammed her gavel down. "This meeting will come to order. We're here to vote on enforcement action regarding Mr. Callahan's non-conforming structure." A board member I hadn't met before, a thin man with glasses, cleared his throat. "Actually, Brenda, I've reviewed Mr. Callahan's application, and it was complete. We should have responded within the time frame. I think we're on shaky ground here." "Thank you, David," Brenda said through clenched teeth. "But as president, I have final say on whether applications meet our standards." "That's not what the bylaws state," I interjected, pulling out the relevant page. "Section 12 clearly states that approval requires a majority vote of the board, not unilateral decisions by the president." More murmurs filled the room. I could see Brenda's carefully constructed authority beginning to crumble. "Furthermore," I continued, "I've consulted with an attorney who specializes in HOA disputes. She confirmed that selective enforcement of bylaws can constitute harassment, especially when coupled with actions like calling law enforcement for non-emergency situations. Brenda's face paled slightly. "Are you threatening legal action against the HOA?" "I'm simply stating facts," I replied calmly. "I followed the rules. I built a fence on my own property with proper permits. The only issue is 2 inches of height, which would have been automatically approved had the board responded in the required time frame." Another board member, an older woman with a kind face, spoke up. "I move that we grant retroactive approval for Mr. Callahan's fence and consider this matter closed." "I second that motion," David added quickly. Brenda looked like she might explode. "We can't just ignore violations because they're minor. We need to vote," David insisted. "That's the procedure, Brenda." Cornered by her own rules, Brenda called for a vote. 3 board members voted to approve my fence, with only Brenda and 1 other member opposed. The matter was officially closed, but the tension in the room remained palpable. As the meeting adjourned, several neighbors approached to introduce themselves, many expressing sympathy about my initiation into Oakridge Heights. Margaret nudged me and whispered, "You've made history." Nobody stands up to Brenda and wins. Unfortunately, my victory was short-lived. 3 days later, I returned home from work to find my fence vandalized. 2 panels had been knocked down and someone had spray-painted "Rule Breaker" across another section. I immediately called the police to file a report, though I had no proof of who had done it. Officer Rodriguez was one of the responding officers, recognition dawning on his face as he approached. "Fence trouble again, Mr. Callahan." I gave him a grim smile. "Different kind this time." As he took photographs and notes, I noticed Brenda and Gary watching from their living room window. When our eyes met, they quickly closed their curtains. "Any idea who might have done this?" Rodriguez asked, though his knowing glance toward the Williams residence suggested he had his suspicions. "I can't prove anything," I replied honestly, "but I recently won an HOA dispute about this fence." Rodriguez nodded. "We'll increase patrols in the area for a few days, and you might want to consider installing security cameras." That night, I ordered a comprehensive security system with multiple cameras covering my property. While waiting for it to arrive, I repaired the damaged fence panels and removed the spray paint as best I could. The vandalism had cost me a day's work and several $100s in materials, but I refused to be intimidated. A week passed without incident. My security system was installed, providing me with some peace of mind. Several neighbors stopped by to express their support, bringing housewarming gifts that had mysteriously never materialized during my first 6 months in the neighborhood. Margaret explained that Brenda had an unofficial policy of freezing out new residents until they proved they would fit in with her vision for the community. Then came the water bill 3 times higher than my previous month's usage. Confused, I checked all my fixtures for leaks but found nothing. It wasn't until I was working in my newly fenced backyard that I noticed soggy patches of ground near the property line with the Williamses. Upon closer inspection, I discovered that someone had redirected a drainage pipe from their yard to flow directly under my fence, creating a constant stream of water into my yard. My security cameras hadn't caught the act itself, as they'd been installed after the fact, but they did capture Gary Williams inspecting that section of the fence late one evening, seeming to check if his handiwork was still in place. I considered confronting them directly, but decided on a different approach. I invited a town building inspector to review my drainage situation, citing concerns about potential foundation damage. The inspector quickly identified the improperly diverted drainage and documented it thoroughly. "This is a clear code violation," he explained. Homeowners cannot redirect drainage onto neighboring properties. I'll have to issue a citation to your neighbors." When the inspector knocked on the Williamses' door, I watched from my security camera feed as Brenda's expression shifted from smug confidence to horror as she was handed the citation. The inspector pointed to the drainage pipe, and Gary emerged, his face red as he gesticulated wildly. I couldn't hear the conversation, but their body language told me everything I needed to know. That evening, my doorbell rang. I checked the camera feed to find Brenda standing on my porch, her posture rigid and formal. Against my better judgment, I opened the door. "Mr. Callahan," she began, her voice straining for civility, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding about our drainage system." "No misunderstanding," I replied calmly. "Your husband redirected your drainage pipe to flood my yard. The building inspector confirmed it." Brenda's facade cracked slightly. "That's a serious accusation. Gary was simply trying to address a pre-existing drainage issue that your fence exacerbated. The security camera footage showing him inspecting his handiwork suggests otherwise," I said. "As does the fact that I had no drainage issues before the HOA meeting where you lost the vote about my fence." Her eyes widened slightly at the mention of security cameras. "You're recording us." "I'm recording my property," I clarified. "After someone vandalized my fence, it seemed prudent." Brenda's lips pressed into a thin line. "Well, we'll be fixing the drainage pipe tomorrow. I trust that will resolve the matter. The citation requires you to fix it, yes. But this pattern of harassment needs to stop, Brenda. Next time, I won't be so accommodating." As predicted, the drainage pipe was redirected the next day, and my yard began to dry out. I thought perhaps Brenda and Gary had finally accepted defeat, but I underestimated their determination. 2 weeks later, I received another certified letter, this time notifying me that the HOA was fining me for unapproved landscape modifications. According to the letter, the garden beds I'd started installing in my backyard violated regulations, requiring pre-approval for any landscape changes visible from neighboring properties. The letter was technically correct. My garden beds could be seen from second-story windows of adjacent homes, and I hadn't submitted plans for them. But neither had anyone else in the neighborhood, as far as I could tell. Selective enforcement was becoming Brenda's weapon of choice. I decided it was time to go on the offensive. I spent a weekend driving around Oakridge Heights, photographing dozens of violations far more egregious than my garden bed's unapproved sheds, mismatched fencing, non-regulation mailboxes, and even a bright purple front door that certainly hadn't been approved by Brenda's aesthetic committee. With my evidence compiled, I attended the next regular HOA meeting. When Brenda opened the floor for new business, I stood up. "I'd like to discuss the selective enforcement of HOA regulations," I said, connecting my laptop to the projector. "Over the past month, I've been cited twice for minor infractions, while numerous other violations throughout the neighborhood go unaddressed." I began my slideshow, methodically displaying each violation with its corresponding bylaw. "This shed on Maple Drive exceeds height restrictions by 3 feet. This fence on Oak Street uses unapproved materials. This landscaping on Pine Avenue blocks the required sightline for the street corner." The room grew increasingly uncomfortable as I continued, eventually arriving at my piece de resistance: photos of Brenda and Gary's own property. And finally, the Williams residence has non-regulation window treatments, an unapproved satellite dish installation, and landscape lighting that exceeds the allowed lumens per our dark sky provisions. Brenda's face had progressed through various shades of red during my presentation. Now she slammed her gavel down. This is outrageous. You've been trespassing and harassing homeowners. All photos were taken from public streets or sidewalks, I replied calmly. And I'm not harassing anyone. I'm simply pointing out that if the HOA intends to fine me for minor infractions, it should enforce all regulations equally for all residents. David, the sympathetic board member, cleared his throat. He has a point, Brenda. We can't selectively enforce the bylaws. This is different, Brenda insisted. Mr. Callahan is new and hasn't demonstrated a commitment to our community standards. An older gentleman in the back spoke up. I've lived here for 20 years, and I've never seen the bylaws enforced this aggressively. Maybe it's time for some new leadership on the board. Murmurs of agreement spread through the room. Brenda looked around in disbelief, realizing she was losing her audience. Gary stood up, his face purple with rage. Now wait just a minute. My wife has dedicated years to this community. She's maintained our property values when other neighborhoods have declined. You should be thanking her instead of siding with this troublemaker. The room fell silent at his outburst. Then Margaret spoke up from her seat. Maybe we should call for a special election for board positions. It's been 5 years since we've had a contested election. That's not necessary, Brenda said quickly. The annual meeting is only 3 months away. According to the bylaws, I interjected, a special election can be called if 30% of homeowners petition for one. Given the turnout tonight, we could probably get those signatures before leaving this room. Brenda's eyes darted around, calculating her options. Finally, she forced a tight smile. Perhaps we've been a bit overzealous in enforcement recently. In the spirit of community harmony, I move that we rescind the landscaping violation against Mr. Callahan and form a committee to review our enforcement procedures to ensure consistency. It was a strategic retreat, but I recognized it for what it was, a temporary truce, not a surrender. I nodded in acceptance, knowing I'd won this battle, but the war was far from over. Over the next month, things quieted down. My garden flourished behind my contentious fence, and I began making friends in the neighborhood. Margaret invited me to her book club, where I discovered that many residents had their own Brenda stories, but had learned to keep their heads down to avoid her wrath. The committee to review enforcement procedures was formed, with David as chair and me as a member, much to Brenda's chagrin. Then came the anonymous letter in my mailbox, no stamp, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message. Check your deed restrictions. Fences prohibited on corner lots. You're on borrowed time. I pulled out my property documents and scoured them carefully. There it was, in a decades-old covenant that predated the HOA, a restriction preventing fences on corner lots, to maintain visibility at intersections. My property, while not on a traditional corner, was technically at the intersection of the main road and a small access lane that led to a community park. The restriction was archaic and likely unenforceable given modern standards, but it gave Brenda a new angle of attack. Sure enough, 3 days later, I received an official notice from the HOA legal counsel stating that my fence violated deed restrictions and must be removed within 30 days. This time, I didn't hesitate. I called Patricia Campbell, the HOA attorney I'd consulted earlier, and retained her services officially. She reviewed my documents and quickly identified several defenses. First, she explained during our meeting at her downtown Fairfield office, that deed restriction is likely unenforceable due to its age and vagueness. Second, the HOA has approved numerous fences on similar lots over the years, which constitutes waiver by acquiescence. Third, the restriction specifically mentions visibility at intersections, but your fence doesn't impair visibility for the access lane. So what's our next step? I asked. Patricia smiled. We respond formally, denying their claim and requesting mediation as required by Connecticut law before any legal action can be taken. That buys us time and forces them to incur legal expenses if they want to pursue this. The mediation was scheduled for the following month. In the meantime, rumors spread throughout the neighborhood about the escalating fence dispute. Surprisingly, many neighbors expressed support for my position, tired of Brenda's iron-fisted rule. Some even offered to testify about similar structures that had been approved without issue. The day before our mediation session, I received an unexpected visitor, David, the sympathetic board member. "I'm not supposed to be here," he said nervously, glancing around as if expecting Brenda to leap out from behind a bush. "But you need to know something before tomorrow." We sat on my back porch, the controversial fence providing privacy from prying eyes. "Brenda and Gary don't actually care about your fence," David explained. "This is about control and making an example of you. They've done this before, targeted a new homeowner who challenged them, escalated until the person either caved or moved out." "That's harassment," I said, anger rising. David nodded. "Yes, but it's been effective. The last guy who stood up to them ended up selling at a loss just to escape. But here's what you really need to know. Brenda's position as HOA president isn't just about power. She and Gary run a home renovation business. They use the HOA violations to generate business, first create a problem, then offer to fix it at a premium." The pieces suddenly clicked into place. "So when I built my own fence instead of hiring a contractor, you didn't just bypass their authority, you bypassed their business model," David confirmed. "They typically steer violation recipients toward approved vendors, which happen to be contractors who give them kickbacks or their own company operating under a different name." I was stunned. "That's not just unethical, it's potentially illegal." "Exactly, and there's more. I've been quietly gathering evidence for months. Financial records show HOA funds being used for consulting services from a company called Will Craft Enterprises, which is registered to Gary Williams. The board never approved these payments. Brenda authorized them unilaterally." "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. David sighed. "Because they're not going to stop with your fence. They can't afford to lose, or others might start asking questions. I've been too afraid to speak up alone, but if you're willing to fight them publicly, I'll provide the evidence." The mediation the next day was tense. Brenda and Gary arrived with their attorney, a slick corporate lawyer who clearly expected to intimidate us. Patricia Campbell, however, was unflappable. "My client's position is simple," she stated after introductions. "The deed restriction is archaic, has not been consistently enforced, and does not apply to Mr. Callahan's fence given its location and design. Furthermore, we have evidence suggesting a pattern of selective enforcement and potential conflicts of interest in HOA operations." The mediator, a retired judge, raised his eyebrows. "Conflicts of interest," Patricia nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. We have documentation indicating that HOA President Brenda Williams and her husband, Gary, have been using their positions to direct business to their own construction company and receiving improper payments from HOA funds." Brenda gasped audibly. "That's slander. We've done nothing wrong." "Then you won't mind an audit of HOA finances," I suggested calmly. Gary leaned forward, his face menacing. "You have no right to make these accusations. This is about your non-compliant fence, nothing more." The mediator held up his hand. "Let's stay focused. These additional allegations, while serious, are separate from the fence dispute." Patricia smiled. "With respect, Your Honor, they're directly relevant. Our position is that the fence violation is being pursued not because of any actual non-compliance, but as retaliation and as part of a pattern of abusing HOA authority for personal gain. The mediation continued for hours, with no resolution in sight. Brenda and Gary refused to budge on the fence issue, and we refused to concede. By the end of the day, the mediator declared an impasse. Since we couldn't reach an agreement, he explained, the HOA is free to pursue legal action if they choose, and Mr. Callahan is free to defend himself. As we were gathering our materials to leave, Patricia handed Brenda's attorney a sealed envelope. This is a formal request for all HOA financial records for the past 5 years, pursuant to Connecticut General Statutes Section 47250. We're also filing a complaint with the State Attorney General's office regarding the potential misappropriation of HOA funds. The color drained from Brenda's face. You're bluffing. You have no evidence. I met her gaze steadily. We have board members willing to testify, financial records showing irregular payments, and documentation of your selective enforcement patterns. This stopped being about my fence a long time ago, Brenda. The following weeks were tense. True to our word, Patricia filed complaints with the appropriate authorities. David and 2 other board members came forward with their concerns about financial improprieties. An emergency HOA meeting was called, where Brenda and Gary faced a barrage of questions from suddenly emboldened neighbors. Is it true you've been paying your own company with HOA funds? Why are violations only enforced against people who don't use your recommended contractors? How much have you personally profited from your position? Brenda attempted to maintain control, but the tide had turned. When a motion was made to suspend her as president pending an investigation, the vote was overwhelmingly in favor. Gary exploded, pointing at me from across the room. This is all your fault. You've destroyed everything we've built here, all because of that damned fence. 2 days later, my security cameras captured Gary approaching my fence at 2 a.m. with what appeared to be a can of gasoline and a lighter. I immediately called 911, watching in horror as he doused a section of the fence and flicked his lighter. The police arrived within minutes, catching Gary in the act. He was arrested on the spot for attempted arson, criminal mischief, and trespassing. The incident made the local news, bringing unwanted attention to our quiet community and the ongoing HOA dispute. With Gary in legal trouble and Brenda suspended from the board, an interim president was appointed, Margaret, who immediately called for a forensic audit of the HOA finances. The results were damning. Over 5 years, Brenda and Gary had diverted nearly $200,000 in HOA funds to their various shell companies for services that were either overpriced or never performed. The district attorney's office filed charges against both Brenda and Gary for fraud, embezzlement, and misappropriation of funds. Gary's arson attempt had only compounded their legal troubles. Their reign of terror over Oakridge Heights was finally over. 6 months later, the community gathered for a neighborhood barbecue in the park adjacent to my property. My once controversial fence now stood as a symbol of resistance against corruption and abuse of power. The new HOA board, led by Margaret with David as vice president, had implemented transparent processes and reasonable enforcement of the bylaws. As I grilled hamburgers for my neighbors, Patricia Campbell stopped by with news. The Williams trial starts next month. The prosecutor is confident they'll both serve time, especially Gary with the arson charge. What about the house? I asked, knowing the Williamses had moved out after being ostracized by the community. Being sold to pay restitution to the HOA, she replied. The good news is your fence is officially, permanently approved. The board even amended the bylaws to clarify the height restrictions and approval process. I laughed. All this over 2 inches of cedar. Patricia shook her head. It was never about the fence, Ian. It was about standing up to bullies who thought they were above the rules. As the sun set over Oakridge Heights, I surveyed my garden sanctuary behind its hard-won fence. The roses were blooming, the vegetables were thriving, and for the first time since moving in, I felt truly at home. Sometimes, I reflected, you have to build a fence to bring down walls. The night of the barbecue, as neighbors chatted and children played, I found myself standing at the edge of my property with Margaret and several other longtime residents. "You know," Margaret said thoughtfully, "in 15 years here, this is the first time I've felt like we're actually a community instead of Brenda's subjects. It's amazing what happens when people aren't afraid to use their own gardens or paint their shutters," another neighbor added. David joined us, handing me a cold beer. "The final audit report came in today. You won't believe this, they found evidence that Brenda and Gary had been skimming from the HOA reserve fund since their 2nd year in office. That's why our road repaving project kept getting delayed." "What happens now?" I asked. "Full restitution to the HOA if they can pay it," David replied. "And the prosecutor is pushing for maximum sentences given the breach of fiduciary duty." I gazed across the neighborhood, at the homes and gardens now flourishing with individual character. You know what's ironic? Brenda always claimed she was protecting property values, but our real estate agent says home prices in Oakridge Heights have jumped 15% since the new board took over. Turns out, people prefer communities where they can actually enjoy their property. Margaret raised her glass. "To fences that make good neighbors by keeping the bad ones out." We all laughed and clinked glasses, celebrating not just the end of a regime but the beginning of something better. My fence stood firm behind us, no longer a symbol of defiance but of the boundaries necessary for a healthy community, clear, reasonable, and respected by all. 1 year after the fence incident, Oakridge Heights had transformed. The Williamses had both received sentences, Gary for 3 years for embezzlement and attempted arson, Brenda for 18 months for fraud and misappropriation of funds. Their house had been sold, with proceeds going toward restitution to the HOA. With the recovered funds, the community had repaved roads, renovated the community center, and established a more modest reserve fund with transparent reporting. Quarterly social events brought neighbors together, and a mentoring program paired longtime residents with newcomers to help them navigate life in Oakridge Heights without the trauma I'd experienced. My garden behind the infamous fence had become something of a local attraction, with the garden club requesting a tour each season. I'd expanded it to include a small meditation area with a pond, finding peace in the space I'd fought so hard to define. As for me, I found more than just a home in Oakridge Heights. I found a community worth fighting for, friendships that sustained me through the battle, and eventually, something I hadn't expected, a second chance at love. Patricia Campbell, my fierce attorney, had become more than just my legal advocate. Our professional relationship had evolved into friendship during the HOA ordeal, and then, gradually, into something more. On the anniversary of the day Gary Williams called 911 over my fence, Patricia and I hosted a neighborhood dinner in my backyard. As the evening wound down and neighbors departed, we sat alone on the patio, looking up at the stars visible above my not-quite-regulation height fence. "Hard to believe it's been a year," Patricia mused, her hand warm in mine. "From HOA nightmare to this." I squeezed her hand. "I never thought I'd be grateful for Brenda Williams and her vendetta against my fence, but without her, I wouldn't have found you." Patricia laughed. That's quite the silver lining, though I wouldn't recommend HOA disputes as a dating strategy for everyone. I looked around at my property, the fence that had started it all, the garden that had flourished behind it, the home that had finally become a sanctuary. You know, I said thoughtfully, when I built that fence, I was just trying to create a boundary, a private space to heal after the divorce. I never expected it would actually open my world instead of closing it off. Patricia leaned her head against my shoulder. Sometimes the strongest fences make room for the most beautiful gardens. I couldn't have said it better myself. In standing up for my right to define my own boundaries, I had helped an entire community redefine theirs not as weapons of control or exclusion, but as the clear lines that allow good neighbors to thrive side by side, each in their own way, yet still connected. And that, I realized, was worth every inch of that 2-inch too tall fence that had changed everything.